Hey horror fans, Bored Now and Rachel McDonald back with you, and we return to the haunting of Hill House. So this is going to be episode 5 review of that. It's called The Bent Neck Lady, so big episode, I think you can tell by the title. And it's a Nell centric episode, so we go back to kind of how she first experiences the bent neck lady at Hill House. It flashes back to the very first night and how it first appears to her. And then we sort of really go through the years and like the fallout of how traumatized she is from that experience. We see her meeting Arthur, who obviously becomes her husband. And that's because she's obviously having psychological repercussions. She's having problems sort of sleeping and is like constantly having dreams and like sleepwalking. So he's they call him like a sleep tech in the episode, don't they? And that's kind of how they meet, and we see their relationship blossom, them get married, but then obviously there's a dark twist to what happens to poor Arthur later on in the episode. But we obviously get to know Nell better, and we get to know exactly what she experienced. And this really focuses on the bent neck lady, and there's some big developments later on in the episode. They actually spend quite a lot of time with Nell in the episode and build into these things. And the stuff at Hill House at the end of the episode is really dramatic, and the places that goes. We also see more of the complications in the relationship with her and the siblings, which we'll talk about in this review. But Rachel, what did you think?
Oh, okay. So Nell Crane just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
This episode is really intense. Obviously, every Hill House episode is really intense. But so up until this point, we know that Nell has died. We know that she's died in the house, and we know that most of his siblings are under the impression that she committed suicide. Now, of course, we talked about in Luke's episode how his episode ends with Steve telling Luke it was suicide and Luke saying, no, it wasn't, hinting that there is something more that we need to discover. And of course, this episode explains that. So we have a fantastic opening scene of little Nellie waking up in Hill House, seeing the bent neck lady and screaming and waking Luke up. Horrifically creepy scene. Very effective opening, showing how Nellie has been haunted since she was a child. And of course, we see her crying to her parents and her parents telling her that it's not true. And it kind of brings up this recurring theme between her and Luke of they are the two most haunted kids in the house. We talked about that in Luke's episode. But no one believes them. No one believes them that they're actually seeing these ghosts. And it's actually really sad. And that kind of comes up later in the episode of people not believing Nellie and not believing what she's seeing. So, of course, we see her as a child again, seeing the bent neck lady, having these recurring visions where she can't move. And then, of course, it segues into her meeting Arthur, which is just the most adorable meeting ever.
Yeah,
it's so cute.
It's Arthur great, isn't it?
Yeah, he's a great character. They have great chemistry. They hit it up right away. And I really like that, again, we stumble into this territory of, is it supernatural or is it reality? Because sleep paralysis, which is what Nell suffers from, is a very real disorder and actually affects people the exact way that you see it affect Nell, where you wake up while you're still in REM sleep and your muscles haven't woken up yet, because when you're in REM sleep you don't move. Your body goes into a state where it doesn't actually move. So you wake up, you feel like you can't move, and you even sometimes see hallucinations. People who talk about having sleep paralysis talk about seeing figures at the end of the bed. So again, it leans into that whole, is Nell actually seeing a ghost, or is this just a figment of her sleep paralysis? And I really like the blurring of the lines in this series, how they show that some stuff is supernatural, but some stuff might actually have a very rational explanation. And sleep paralysis is one of those things that has kind of the effects that Nell is experiencing. I also really like that they have a little callback to the season 1 opener where Nellie wakes up and her dad talks about how dreams sometimes spill And Arthur kind of says the same thing. He says, when you wake up between waking and sleeping, sometimes your dreams come over sometimes. And Nell's like, they spill. And so I thought that was like a really sweet little callback to little Nell at the beginning talking to her father. And then, of course, you see her and Arthur's romance, and it's just the sweetest thing ever. It's done in this beautiful little montage where you see them go on their first date. You see him propose to her with her family there. You see them get married. And of course, we see their wedding again. We've already seen bits of their wedding. We've already seen that, you know, Luke tried to turn up and was turned away by Shirley. We've seen that Shirley and Theo and Stephen are all there. And I was thinking this whole time, I think I brought it up in one of the previous episodes, that each of the Crane kids is supposed to represent a stage of grief. Nell, surprisingly, is supposed to represent acceptance, which is very interesting, I think, because when you watch Nell until her husband dies, she actually does seem like she is the most well-adjusted of the kids. She is in touch with all of her family. She's in touch with her father. She seems to, you know, have a good life and have moved on kind of from the events of Hill House. And then her husband's death seems to trigger that and brings everything back, and is like the starting point for her, that she starts to spiral back into the trauma and the anxiety from her childhood. And I think the episode does a really good job of showing how that depression and how that grief starts to separate her from her siblings. We see her and Theo have a fight when she asks Theo to come and do a reading, like to kind of feel if Arthur's there, and Theo points out that Nell is not doing well. We see her confront Steve. There's a horrible scene with her and Luke, which we'll get into. And it just kind of shows the distancing from her family and how in her grief over Arthur's death, she's kind of drawn away to the point that they would believe that she might actually kill herself, which is, again, very interesting because I don't know about you, but I felt throughout the entire episode that while Nell was obviously grieving and she was depressed, she wasn't suicidal. She wasn't thinking of killing herself.
No, I would say you wouldn't necessarily jump to that, no.
No. So I think it's so sad that her death ends up being ruled a suicide when she obviously didn't go to the house to die. She went to the house to confront her fear. So I think this episode does a really good job of showing how Nell's relationships with her siblings broke down after her husband's death, and how the reappearance of the bent neck lady has triggered the trauma from her childhood. So I found it to be a very effective and very sad episode. What about you?
Yeah, powerful stuff. Very sad. Again, the horror scenes were very well handled. I think the way we see Hill House in this episode, the way it plays such a part as a character in itself, it's almost like the best use of Hill House so far in the series. That end scene in particular.
Yes.
But yeah, no, now I think is a very emotional, a very vulnerable, but also appealing character in this, and we see the good and the bad sides to her as well. Oh, one thing I like, just speaking of the first scene, or the bent neck lady scene, is I sort of like the touch that it was in a way Nell who named her, because she like gives that, and obviously there's sort of a twist at the end anyway that we'll talk about, but I did like how that fits into some of the stuff we've talked about in your head and stuff like that. It's almost like you would give it a name sort of thing, but I think it's that thing of processing as a kid as well. I think whereas as an adult, if you saw something, you'd say, well, that was just freaky. You wouldn't necessarily name it, but as a kid, I think you sort of do. It's the way to describe it to the adult and the way to kind of process it. And I think it just shows how, as a child, your mind works a bit differently than as an adult. So I like the touch of her in a way, giving it the name. And there's stuff in this episode where, because she starts seeing this therapist, and well, here's the thing as well, just to be a nerd for a moment, because it's the same actor who plays the Doctor in Twin Peaks.
Yes.
So it's sort of hilarious he's playing a doctor again and a therapist. And I saw him in something recently. I can't remember what, and I'm pretty sure he was playing a therapist in that as well. So I guess he's been a little bit typecast. But Yeah, he plays a therapist who she's only been seeing for like something like a few months, and Theo in the scene with her and now is very brutal about what is this guy doing, because since you've started seeing him, your life has, if anything, gotten worse. She sees obviously the state of her apartment.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's sort of this contrast in a way where I think I agree with what you're expressing. Then this guy isn't a good therapist, and a lot of his suggestions, it is bad because obviously he has the suggestion about confronting her family and just gives her really bad advice. And to Arthur, who was in a way, although his job wasn't necessarily as a therapist, in some ways he was a much better sort of therapist.
Oh yeah.
In the advice, the support. I think you can see why Arthur maybe would be the perfect partner for Nell, because in his profession he obviously understands what she's going through. And one thing I liked about that scene with her and Arthur, the first one, is she makes a point of saying you're the first sort of doctor not to talk down to me, not to like just pass it off as something and say, you know, take this medication or you know, hold back. He actually talks to her as a human being, and I think that's why they connect so much, and you can see why they would. He's a really appealing character, and as we said, there's this chemistry, and there's a funny lighter touch of her like asking him out and thinking that she's misread the signs, and he sort of comes back with, well, I was going to wait till the end of the appointment so that's a really funny line. And obviously they have to sell you on their relationship, because otherwise you might think, well, is this a bit forced? You know, she's like going on a date with a tech doctor or sleep check, as they call it. But no, it works really well, and I think that makes a good point when you compare it to, I can't remember his name, let's just call him Dr. Jacoby, really. Okay. I mean, he's probably not as creepy as Dr. Jacoby, but he's certainly, I would say he's on the level in terms of how effective he actually is as a doctor. I mean, maybe arguably Jacoby, for his dark shit, is maybe actually a little better at his job than this guy is. But yeah, he's not great. And I actually really like the scene with Theo, because Theo is really brutally honest with her, and in a good way, because I think now in that scene just isn't dealing with things. And I like them. Theo is essentially saying to her, you need to get out. We need to go and do something as sisters, because this is what's healthy for you, getting back to doing normal things. And she doesn't hold back, but obviously she's not like a total bitch about it. It's sort of constructive things that is going to improve Nell's life, but she doesn't hold back about saying, look at this apartment, look at the state of you. Obviously at one point we see Nell obviously sort of throw her drugs away, you know, flush them.
I think this episode does a good job of showing how Nell's grief over her husband has obviously made her close off from her siblings, because before he dies, we see that her siblings are a part of her life. You know, we see that some of them are there when he proposes to her. We see them at her wedding. We see that her dad's there. She obviously does have possibly the best relationship with her siblings than they have with each other. And so I think it's very sad that in the wake of her husband's death, when all the stuff from Hill House starts to come up, this obviously triggers stuff, and we see that she starts to fracture with her siblings. So the scene with Theo is a great example. You know, obviously they have been close. They've maintained a close relationship enough that Theo has come out to visit her. And I agree with what you're saying, that Theo it tells her some harsh truths, but they're truths that she needs to hear. She needs to hear that she needs to get herself together. She needs to, you know, stop isolating herself so much, because it's just not good for her. And as Theo points out, she knows what she's talking about. She herself is a psychiatrist, so she knows that whatever this doctor is doing is not helping Nell. And so I thought that scene was very good. And of course we get that the scene in the first episode where Theo says that she hasn't spoken to Nell since the LA incident. And so this is obviously the incident that we see. That's what's happened, because Nell is unfortunately in her grief quite harsh to Theo and tells Theo that she's never cared about anyone except herself, which is just blatantly untrue. And that, you know, like she says some harsh things to her and basically Theo ends up storming out. And while Nell is grieving, it is also hard to see her turn on her siblings like that, which brings me to the scene with Steve, where she goes to confront Steve at the advice of her quack doctor. And she picks a very public, very inappropriate place to confront him. And I kind of think in that scene that while what Nellie is saying to Steve, she should be able to say, she should not say it in those circumstances. Like Steve points out, because she turns up at a book reading of his, and he essentially points out that, like, this is his office, this is his place of work. You don't turn up to someone's place of work to have an emotional conversation. But what Nell is saying about how you never believed me, you never believed Luke, you said I was crazy, you said Mum was crazy, and then you turn around and you write a book about us and you make so much money off this book, and you were never there for me when we were kids. Like, that obviously needed to be said. That's stuff that she's held on to. They obviously all still have this trauma from childhood, but I think the fact that she chooses to do it in such a public place does show that she's not mentally she's not in the right mind frame at that point in time. You know, she's obviously making rash decisions. She's making decisions to confront family members in bad ways, in bad situations. And it's just showing the cracks so that we get to the point that where she does start to call them all, we can see why they might decline her calls, because they've all had these bad experiences with her recently. They know that she's not, you know, herself at the moment. So I think it definitely adds to that whole thing that we saw in the first episode of them kind of avoiding her calls and being like, well, it's Nell, she's got her own issues to deal with. We see that build up here. I do find it interesting that they didn't have a scene with her and Shirley. They had scenes with her and Theo, her and Luke, and her and Steve, but nothing with her and Shirley. So I guess she and Shirley don't really have any bad blood between them when they when she passes away. Maybe they just didn't have room for it in the episode because it is quite a packed episode. But it was interesting, I thought, that they didn't have a scene with her and Shirley, because they're obviously showing how the rest of her relationships are fracturing. The scene with her and Luke is a very heartbreaking scene to watch, and I think it's one of the most impactful of the episode. So we see her
just before we go to that, because the small thing on Sherry is, I guess, the lighter scene is the scene at the wedding where Stephen's like making fun of Sherry watching Theo dance with this. It's obviously we've seen it. It's like the Bridesmaids or something, because we got a little bit of that in the and I think that sort of kind of shines a light on maybe how old-fashioned Sherry is, because it certainly suggests that she wouldn't be very forward-thinking about, you know, finding out her sister's a lesbian. So there's that scene as well, but that's that's all
it's a cute scene, and it does nicely offset the scene of her and Steve later on, to see how fractured they've become, that they've gone from laughing and dancing at her wedding to having a public brawl and you know, confronting one another. So definitely shows that. But that is a very cute scene, how they're just kind of watching Shirley and they're like, come on, any moment she's gonna clue in. And Shirley sees it, she's like, oh, did you see? And she's just that
the scene with Luke.
This is maybe one of the worst things we've seen of Luke. So we know that Luke's story is he's been in rehab. He's been in this community rehab. So we see Nellie take him there. This is the night that she's going to take him there. Except that before she takes him there, he needs to, in his words, get well, which is essentially saying he needs to have one last hit before he can go in. And because he has pissed off his drug dealer so many times and owes him so much money, he sends Nellie to buy him heroin in what is possibly one of the saddest scenes, because I think it's one of Luke's worst actions that we've seen him take. Again, we've slowly seen how his addiction has affected all his siblings. And we can see in this scene that Nell really believes in him. You know, she's saying to him, it's so good that you're going here. I believe in you. I want to support you. And when he asks her to buy him drugs, you can just see the devastation on her face. But he's her twin, so of course she's going to do anything for him, even if it's not something particularly healthy. And then the horror on her face when she comes back and she's like, he spat it out of his mouth, like she's never been in this world. And then she has to sit and watch Luke shoot up next to her. Yeah, it's quite a hard scene to take. How did you feel during that scene? I found it quite hard to watch. What about you?
Yeah, very uncomfortable, devastated for now. I think in terms of like emotion and just feeling so bad for now, I think that's one of the scenes that really hits home. And again, I think the way Luke comes across in that scene is that he's very self-involved, not only for what he does, asking her to do that and then shooting up, but also just the way he is in the car on the drive over, because she's taking an interest, she's happy to pick him up. I think that's another key part of the drama, is that she picks him up in the belief that he's going to rehab, and she's happy to do it. So when out of the blue he asks her that, I think she really sells it, the actress, in the face, and she's like, oh my God, this is terrible. This is not why I picked you up. But I think, the way Luke talks to her in the scene is very self-involved, because he doesn't take any interest in what's happening in her life. And I think, again, just having a little bit of experience in dealing with people in these situations, I think that is a realistic trait of them sometimes, that they're just so caught up and they're so absorbed and kind of addicted to this whole thing. And throughout the scene, I think Luke is almost selling her a line. It's almost like he's desperate to get to the drugs, and I think on some level he obviously believes that it's like one hit and then that's it, he'll go to rehab, and he sort of talked himself into that, but obviously he's not thinking straight. And as far as Luke goes, it's one of his worst scenes, at just him as a person, because he's so self-involved in it. And to actually put your twin sister in that sort of a position is just terrible, really. I think it's a really well shot scene, and the drama and the way, again, Nell sells it from her point of view. It's all about her reaction. So it's a very sad scene.
It is. And of course, right at the end of the scene, she sees the bent neck lady, which obviously to her is an omen of doom, and probably at that point in time, seeing her would have scared her a lot because of the situation that she's in, taking her brother to rehab, not knowing if he's going to be okay. That would have definitely been an omen. But I definitely agree with what you're saying with Luke being self-centered, because I think even at one point in time he's like, oh, how are you, how have you been doing? And Nell starts talking about how it's been hard since Arthur and how she can't sleep, and then Luke just kind of steamrolls right over her. It's like, go buy me drugs. And again, it shows that fracturing between Nell and her siblings, which allows her to end up in that vulnerable place where the house starts to call her back. And so we're getting towards the end of the episode here. So obviously we're taken through Nell's journey. We see how her mental state has unraveled. We see how the bent neck lady has returned. And then we see her go to confront Hill House at the advice of her doctor. And we see a little bit more flashback of the night in question, where they fled the house, and we get a tiny little bit of a hint of what's going on when little Stephen asks Nellie and Luke what's going on, and Luke says, we were having a tea party with Mum and Abigail in the Red Room, and Shirley's like, the Red Room doesn't open, and Nellie just says, that wasn't Mummy, and that's it. That's like the only hint we get. And again, this is going to come back in several episodes as to what actually happened that night in the house. But we see the house kind of take Nell back, and I feel like they're trying to make some sort of correlation between, like, Nell's grief has opened her back up to the house, like her trauma coming back has opened her back up to being taken by the house, and we see her go to the house, and of course when she gets there, the house gives her hallucinations of her family. And I think it's really sad the way the house lies to her and shows her family, and her family is supportive, and they're apologizing for fighting, and they're apologizing for not being there, and then she sees Luke and he's clean and he's sober, and then he steps aside and she sees Arthur, and I think Victoria Pedretti just sells that emotion. Like her face when she sees her husband, all of her grief just coming to the surface. It's such a beautiful scene, but at the same time, it's so horrifying because it's the house, and it's the house trying to like take her. So it's like this beautiful scene that should be happy, but it's actually really horrifying. And I think that's really emphasized by the shot where she goes dancing through the house with Arthur, and then they cut away to a shot that just shows her dancing by herself in this empty, eerie house.
Yeah, and she's alone. That's the reality. I think that's what they're going for.
And I think that scene does it really well. What about you?
Yeah, it's really powerful stuff. That Nell's been like ripping the wallpaper.
Yes.
And you've got that message on the wall, and it's like, Nell, come home. And I think this feeds into this whole thing of the house trying to manipulate her, and it's sort of almost bittersweet in some ways. I think in some ways I don't necessarily see it as negative as you. I think they do make death in this case very beautiful, very sort of romantic and sort of idealized. And I definitely agree then by contrast they're sort of showing this is the harsh reality. But I think in some ways they're playing on this whole thing of this was just Nell's path, this was her destiny, then she ultimately wouldn't escape the house. She would be drawn back to it. And I think that's partly what they're setting up with that message on the wall, Nell, come home. And obviously we have the stuff with the mother as well. But I think obviously you're right to point out then a lot of it is the house lying to her, being sort of like wailed for Nell when she goes back to the house.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways it's a positive just because at least on some level she's confronted it and it is a cathartic sort of thing. But it's almost like she goes there for peace, but it's like this false sort of sense of what a peaceful, because obviously I think what this show is doing is contrasting the supernatural world with the real world. And in the real world, her relationship with her siblings is much more complicated than that. And obviously we see in this episode then she's a very sympathetic character, but like any character in this show, and like realistically anybody in the world, she has her faults and she has moments where you're like, oh, come on now, that was harsh. And so in reality it's a two-way thing where obviously the siblings probably have things to apologize to her about and vice versa. It's not going to work out this clean cut sort of thing where the siblings say, okay, now we screwed up. And that's it. And I think they're sort of playing on it almost being this sort of false version of reality for now. But obviously the stuff with Arthur is very beautiful because it's like he's died and it's like, and again, I think this maybe goes back to possibly Flanagan being into religion and stuff, because this idea of when Nell dies, she obviously gets to be with Arthur again. But no, it's really well done. It's very cinematic. I love the way the house is like captured and shot, and we see so much more of it. And it just adds to the characters and the mystery. And I think it's sort of this thing that Lynch does in some of his films where he makes dark stuff somehow beautiful and sort of engaging, which, I sort of think the ending of Fire Walk with Me, I think, is one of the most darkest scenes, but also one of the most beautiful at the same time. I think that's something Lynch has. But
it's beautiful, but it's unsettling at the same time. You watch Nell in this house and you feel like, the love and stuff that she's feeling from her siblings, but it's a lie. And then of course we get to her actual death, which I think is just devastating because, like I said before, even though she's grieving and she's depressed and stuff, she's not suicidal. She doesn't want to die. And the look of terror on her face when she realizes exactly where she's standing and exactly what is happening to her. You know, you see her mother's ghost manipulating her to the top of the stairs. There's a nice little, well, not nice, kind of horrifying callback to the mother saying in like a second episode, we need to do something about those stairs. I see bodies swinging from those stairs. And of course, the house, through the ghost of Olivia, kills Nell and murders her. And then of course we get this reveal, this glorious, horrifying reveal that the bent neck lady is Nell herself, her own ghost. She has been haunted by the specter of her own death her whole life. And there is something really horrifying about that. But I think it ties into what you were saying in that this was always going to be her destiny. You know, this was like, you know, this was always going to be where she was going to end up. She was going to end up back at home in Hill House. And I think the recurrence of the bent neck lady in her life shows that. And of course, as we get to later episodes, we get a little bit more into the bent neck lady and Nell in the afterlife. But that was a very, very cool reveal. It was a reveal that I didn't see coming. And so when it actually happened, it was like a really good revelation. And when I first watched this series, I remember when that reveal happened, I was completely like shaken to my core by that particular revelation. I thought it was so great. And I was like, I cannot wait to see where we go from here with this, because this episode, I think you mentioned this earlier, is really the most malevolent that we see the house. You know, this is this is the first time we actually see the house take someone, even though we know that it's taken their mother. We haven't seen that incident yet. So this really is the first time we see the house as kind of its own entity taking one of the Cranes, and it's really horrifying and really sad. And I think it's, again, just such a strong episode, exploring Nell and then showing the moments that led to her death. So what about you when that was revealed? Was that a big one for you?
It was, and again, because this is the first time I've watched it since it first was on, I sort of forgotten about that, and it really hit home. And it's a great final shot, just the way they do it, the transition where it's sort of Nell through the years, but it's her sort of like falling down, and it's just in the sort of motion of her obviously being hung, and then you have it's like older Nell appearing to younger Nell, but that's the explanation, and it's really beautiful logical visual of the fact that her neck does snap when she's hanging, or when she's being hung. So it actually makes sense. Then that's what's appearing to younger Nell, and that's what the bent neck lady is. I think they make that work really well. Another thing is, I think, and I'm on board with what you're saying about the mother and the ghost of the mother, but I think because this is my first rewatch and it's been a few years, I think the show is starting to make me question, is the mother more of a villain than she's actually meant to be? And I think from what you're saying, probably not. It is probably the house playing tricks on now. But I don't know. There's just certain things about the mother, and because there's still mysteries to be uncovered, it's sort of making me question if she's like that sympathetic, or
it will be interesting to revisit the events of this episode once we've gotten to a few more episodes along, and then we'll revisit your thoughts on this and see how they go out, because I'm obviously remembering a bit more than you are, so it'll be interesting to see when these developments come along, see if your thinking surrounding Olivia will change, because she is quite malevolent here. Like it's quite creepy, her ghost, and the way she gives Nell the locket that Nell was coveting earlier, and then she kisses her on the forehead, and it's that kiss that pushes her to her death. So it's really kind of horrifying. And you do see in the flashbacks, I think they are subtly showing Olivia kind of slightly being affected by the house. Like we saw in a previous episode, she got a really bad migraine. Again, in this episode, she has another kind of incident where she has another migraine and has to like remove herself. So I think we're slowly seeing the house get to Olivia, which will build up towards the episode where we get the reveal of what happened that night. So it's very interesting the way it's like we talked about earlier about how this show is a bit of a puzzle, and you get pieces of the puzzle and you kind of have to make them fit together as you go along. So it's very interesting the way they do it.
The mythology and what exactly happened to Nell. This is obviously the big episode so far. And I would say just for the ending, this is my favourite ending to an episode so far, because it really lands and it's such a big reveal.
I agree.
I just have a question, actually, going back to the father and in the flashbacks, because they obviously go back to when he took them to the motel and then later on, because that becomes significant because Nell actually goes back to that hotel for a while. I'm assuming the exact same route.
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, because the father actually leaves the kids twice. He goes back to Hill House. He obviously comes back later with blood on his clothes, what appears to be blood. He claims it's something else to Nell. And then he obviously leaves Nell in particular because she's the one who's awake. But he obviously has to go and answer questions. But I don't know, do you think this paints him as maybe not the best father, especially leaving them the first time? The second time's a bit different.
I think at this point, we're supposed to be questioning like Hugh's parenting abilities, and we're supposed to be wondering, why are you leaving your kids alone?
Yeah.
Why are you turning up with paint? But because I can remember what's going to happen, it's painting Hugh in a different light for me. So I think, yes, at this point in time, if I was watching the show with like no knowledge of what was going on, and I think I even had this, I was like, what is up with this dude? Why do you keep leaving your kids? Why are you leaving your kids in the middle of nowhere in some skeezy motel? And I definitely think that we're supposed to think, obviously, that he's not the greatest dad, that something more is going on. But because I like I said, because I watched this series a few times and I know what's going on exactly, it paints him in a different light for me. So I think if I was watching this with no knowledge, I would definitely be thinking this guy is like, you got to sort yourself out, buddy. But because I can remember what's going on, are you not getting the best impression of Hugh at the moment?
There's going to be more reveals with that. There's going to be reveals to why he has blood on his clothes and why exactly he left them. Because the second time he leaves them, it's a bit more understandable. He obviously has to go and answer questions.
Yeah, and I would assume that one of the cops would stay with the kids in that instance.
I think I saw one of the
themselves.
cops like going, and he has arranged apparently for one of the aunts to pick them up. So the second time it is a little bit different, but the first time maybe they're just saying he panicked, and I mean, again, there's going to be more revealed about what happened. So that's a different story. We'll get to another time. So that's episode 5, Bentnet Lady. Really big episode in the season. Yep. We're obviously at the halfway point now. We're both really positive on it. So let us know your thoughts on this episode and on Nell as a character, and what do you think about some of her interactions with her siblings. There's some really meaty stuff in this episode. And what do you think about some of the stuff going on at Hill House with her? And I guess obviously there's probably a lot of people watching these reviews who have already seen the show. But if you are a first-time watcher and you're sort of watching along with us, I think that'll be interesting as well. Like, do you have theories about what's going to happen as we get further in? So let us know your comments, really on both ends, if you're revisiting it or if you're a first-time watcher. So we're going to continue this. We're going to be returning with episode 6 soon, so look out for that review. And check out Rachel's channel as always. I'll stick up the link in the description. So it's Rachel McDonald on YouTube. And we'll be back with more soon. See you guys later.